The silk of Elara's wedding gown was a prison. Each intricate thread of silver embroidery, a shackle. The weight of the pearl-encrusted bodice felt like a stone slab upon her chest, pressing the air from her lungs. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her family's ancestral home, a mausoleum of cold gray stone, and did not recognize the ghost staring back. Her own face, usually animated with a sharp wit and a rebellious fire, was a pale, placid mask. The maids had painted her lips a demure rose, tamed her wild chestnut curls into an elaborate braided crown, and draped her in the history of the Blackwood name. She was no longer Elara, she was a treaty. A sacrifice dressed in white, offered on the altar of a fragile peace. For 5 generations, the Blackwoods and the Graysons had bled each other dry. It began with a disputed border, a strip of fertile land that ran between their estates, fed by the swift, cold waters of the Ashbourne River. A Blackwood ancestor was found dead on that land, a Grayson hunting knife lodged in his back. Retribution was swift and brutal, spawning a cycle of vengeance that had claimed lives, burned harvests, and poisoned the very air of the county. The feud was a living, breathing entity, a beast they all fed with their hatred. The current Lord Blackwood, Alastair, Elara's father, was a man carved from granite and bitterness. The war had taken his father and his younger brother. It had hardened him, turned his heart to flint. But a recent, devastating fire in their western granaries, a fire everyone whispered was set by Grayson men, had crippled them financially. The Graysons, under the shrewd leadership of Lord Cashin Grayson, had suffered their own losses. A ship carrying their entire season's wool export had been mysteriously scuttled in the harbor. Both families were bleeding gold, and even hatred had its price. The offer of a truce, brokered by a weary king himself, was as shocking as a lightning bolt from a clear sky. And its primary condition was this marriage. Elara Blackwood to Caelan Grayson, the enemy's daughter to the enemy's son. "You look suitable," her father's voice cut through the silence, as grating as stone on stone. He stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing figure in his formal black coat. His eyes, the same stormy gray as her own, scanned her, but she saw no fatherly pride in them, only calculation. "Suitable," Elara repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is that what I am, father? A suitable pawn?" Alastair's jaw tightened. "You are a Blackwood. You understand duty. This marriage ends the killing. It secures our future. Your brother, Ronan, will not have to bury his friends as I buried mine. Is that not worth the price of your comfort?" Comfort. He made it sound like she was foregoing a favorite dessert, not her entire life, her freedom, her right to choose whom to love. She thought of Ronan, her fierce, hot-headed younger brother, who had embraced the feud with a zeal that frightened her. He had been livid when the truce was announced, calling it a coward's bargain. Her father was right about one thing. This would protect Ronan from himself. "The Grayson boy," her father began, his voice dropping. "He is his father's son. Do not forget that for a moment. Be polite. Be dutiful. But keep your wits about you. The walls in their house have ears, and their hearts are made of ice." With that final, chilling advice, he offered his arm. The walk to the family chapel was a death march. The air in Blackwood Manor was always cold, but today it felt sepulchral. The portraits of her glowering ancestors seemed to watch her, their painted eyes accusing her of betrayal. She was walking into the lion's den, and her only armor was a silk gown. The chapel was a small, austere building, the stone walls bare of any adornment but the carved Blackwood raven. And there, standing at the altar, was her doom. Caelan Grayson. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and rigid in a formal coat of deep navy. His hair was the color of dark honey, brushed back from a brow that was furrowed in what looked like profound irritation. From this distance, she could see the sharp line of his jaw, clenched tight. He did not turn to look at her as she approached on her father's arm. The insult was deliberate, a clear message. This was no joyful union for him either. The ceremony was a blur of Latin phrases and hollow vows. When the priest instructed Kaelin to place the ring on her finger, his touch was brief, his fingers cold as ice. She risked a glance at his face. His eyes, a startling clear blue, met hers for a fleeting second. They held no warmth, no curiosity, only a flat, simmering resentment that mirrored her own. He saw her not as a woman, but as a Blackwood. A name, a symbol, an enemy. Across the aisle, she felt the weight of another gaze. Lord Cashen Grayson. He was a handsome man, with silver streaks in his hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He looked like a wolf who had just won a long-contested territory. The vows were spoken. The marriage was sealed. Elara Blackwood was now Elara Grayson. There was no feast, no celebration. The truce demanded a union, not a festival. They were to depart for Grayson Manor immediately. As she was handed up into the black lacquered carriage that bore the Grayson Hawk crest, her father gave her one last hard look. Her brother Ronan was nowhere to be seen. The carriage door shut with a definitive thud, plunging her into a dim, velvet-lined confinement with her new husband. The vehicle lurched into motion, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. For a long time, silence reigned, thick and suffocating. Kaelin stared resolutely out the window at the passing countryside, his profile a stark, unyielding line. Finally he spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion, still not looking at her. "Let us be clear, Lady Grayson. This farce changes nothing between our families. You will have your own chambers. You will be afforded every courtesy befitting your new station. But do not expect a husband. I did not want this. I have a life and attachments that this arrangement disrupts. We are prisoners of this peace. Let us at least be civil jailers to one another." Elara felt a hot spike of anger pierce through her numbness. She straightened her spine, turning her own gaze to the window on her side. "You think you are the only one whose life has been disrupted, my lord? You think I dreamed of this? Of you? Do not worry. I want nothing from you but the space to breathe the same air without disgust. Civility is all I require." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Then we understand each other perfectly." The carriage rolled on, carrying them deeper into Grayson lands, towards a home that was now her prison, and a man who was her warden. The feud was over, but the war within their own home had just begun. Grayson Manor was not the den of villainy she had been raised to imagine, but it was a fortress. It was larger and more modern than Blackwood Manor, built of pale limestone that should have been warm, but felt just as cold. The windows were tall and numerous, yet they seemed to let in light without warmth. The staff, a legion of silent, efficient men and women in dove-grey livery, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled hostility. She was the enemy, welcomed by decree, not by heart. Her chambers were in the west wing, a suite of rooms that were opulently furnished but impersonal. The colors were cool blues and silvers, the furniture elegant but severe. It felt like a beautifully appointed cell. A maid, a girl with a pinched face and downcast eyes named Liana, was assigned to her. "Will these rooms be satisfactory, my lady?" Liana asked, her voice a timid whisper. "They are adequate," Elara replied, running a hand over the cold marble of the mantelpiece. She was a ghost here. She left no imprint. Days bled into weeks, forming a monotonous pattern of isolated existence. She took her meals in the grand dining hall, where the only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the occasional stilted remark from Lord Cashen. Kaelin was often absent, managing the estate or, she suspected, avoiding her. When he was present, his civility was a polished shield, impenetrable and cold. She learned the rhythms of the house. Lord Cashen spent his mornings in his study, a room she was never invited to enter. He was always polite, always correct, but his eyes held a constant, calculating gleam. He would ask her about her comfort, about the gardens, but never about her family, never about her thoughts. She was a piece of furniture that had been acquired, a necessary ornament. Her only refuge became the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high with a wrought iron gallery, smelling of old leather and beeswax. The Graysons, it seemed, were great collectors of books. It was here, one rainy afternoon, that the first crack in the icy facade appeared. She was reaching for a volume of poetry on a high shelf when a deep voice behind her made her jump. "I wouldn't have taken you for a reader of sonnets." She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kalen stood there, leaning against a bookshelf, his arms crossed. He was dressed for riding, his boots dusty, his shirt open at the collar. He looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him, and yet the guarded look was still in his eyes. "And what would you have taken me for, my lord?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "A simpleton. A savage." A flicker of something, amusement, crossed his face. "I took you for what you were presented as, a Blackwood. We are raised to believe Blackwoods prefer the clash of steel to the turn of a page. And we are raised to believe Graysons have no use for poetry, only for ledgers and deeds," she retorted, turning back to the shelf, her hand closing around the leather-bound book. "A fair assessment for the most part," he conceded, moving closer. She could smell the scent of horse and fresh air on him. It was strangely disarming. "My father, certainly. But my mother. She loved poetry. This was her collection." The admission startled her. He never spoke of his mother, who had died of a fever years ago. It was a humanizing detail, a glimpse of a past she knew nothing about. "I'm sorry," she said, the words automatic. "Don't be," he said, his tone closing off again. "It was a long time ago." He looked at the book in her hands. Byron. A man tormented by his own passions. An odd choice for a marriage of convenience. "Perhaps it's a form of catharsis," Elara said, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. "To read about feelings too dangerous to feel oneself." His blue eyes studied her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. He was not just seeing the Blackwood daughter. He was seeing her. The intelligence in her gaze, the defiance in her stance, the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. "Perhaps," he murmured. He seemed on the verge of saying something more, then thought better of it. With a curt nod, he turned and left the library, leaving her alone with the ghost of his mother and the unsettling feeling that the ground beneath her feet had shifted, just a little. That night at dinner, the atmosphere was different. The silence was no longer just empty. It was charged. She caught Kalen looking at her several times, a thoughtful, almost puzzled expression on his face. He asked her a question about the book, a simple, polite inquiry, but it was more than he had offered her in weeks. Later, as she prepared for bed, Liana helped her out of her gown. "The master was in a rare mood tonight," the maid commented softly. "He was humming in the hall." Elara's head snapped up. "Humming? Yes, my lady. I haven't heard him do that since, well, in a long time." Elara lay in the vast, cold bed that night, staring at the canopy. The image of Kalen in the library, the hint of a shared humanity, replayed in her mind. He was not the monster she had been taught to hate. He was a man trapped just as she was. And that realization was far more dangerous than simple hatred could ever be. A fragile, tentative truce began to form within the larger one. Kalen started taking his meals more regularly, and the conversations, while still stilted, became less about the weather and more about substantive things. He discovered she had a keen mind for estate management, a skill her father had indulged in her, seeing it as useful. One evening, he mentioned a problem with tenants on the northern border who were refusing to pay their full dues. "Old man Hemlock," Kalen grumbled, pushing his food around his plate. "Stubborn as an oak. Says the land is yielding less. I think he's just holding out, knowing we're stretched thin since the recent troubles." "The land is yielding less," Elara said quietly. Both Kalen and Lord Cashin looked at her. "And how would you know that?" Cashin asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "I've been walking the grounds," she said, meeting his gaze. "With Liana. The soil on the north slope is thin, and the drainage is poor. It's been waterlogged since the spring rains. The crops are stunted. Hemlock isn't being stubborn. He's being honest. If you press him, you'll only breed resentment. If you help him, dig a few drainage ditches, perhaps rotate the crops, you'll secure his loyalty and his future payments. Kalen stared at her, his fork suspended in mid-air. You've been surveying the land. A prison is easier to bear when you understand its layout, she said, a challenge in her eyes. To her astonishment, a slow smile spread across Kalen's face. It transformed him, softening the hard lines, making his blue eyes crinkle at the corners. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it sent an unexpected jolt through her. "She has you there, son," Lord Cashin said, his voice dry, but his eyes were narrowed, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. The next day, Kalen sought her out. "Come with me," he said. It was not a request, but it wasn't a command either. It was an invitation. He took her to the north slope. He showed her the waterlogged fields, and she pointed out the specific areas where the drainage was worst. They spoke to Old Man Hemlock together. The tenant was initially suspicious, hostile even towards the Blackwood girl. But as Elara spoke knowledgeably about soil composition and crop rotation, his demeanor changed. Kalen, following her lead, promised the men and materials for the ditches. As they walked back to the manor, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, a sense of quiet accomplishment settled between them. "You were right," Kalen admitted, his voice grudgingly respectful. "He wasn't cheating. He was desperate. I would have handled it poorly." "You were seeing a problem," Elara said. "I was seeing a person." He stopped walking and turned to face her. The setting sun set his hair ablaze, turning the honey gold to a fiery bronze. "Is that how you see me, Elara? As a problem? Or as a person?" Her breath caught in her throat. He had never used her first name before. It sounded intimate, foreign, and thrilling on his lips. I don't know," she answered honestly, her heart pounding. "I'm trying not to see you as the enemy." "And you," he whispered. In that moment, standing in a field that was no longer a battleground but a place of shared purpose, something shifted irrevocably. The wall of ice between them didn't just crack, a large piece of it melted away, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited a fire she had long thought extinguished. She didn't pull away. The world narrowed to the feel of his calloused fingertips against her skin, the intensity of his blue gaze, the unspoken understanding passing between them. The feud, their families, the reasons for their marriage. It all faded into a distant hum. There was only this. Only him. It was the beginning of something terrifying and beautiful. It was the moment she began to fall in love with her husband. The following weeks were a time of stolen moments and quiet discoveries. Kalen began to include her in his daily life. They rode together across the estate, their horses side by side, discussing improvements, debating books, and slowly, carefully, sharing pieces of their pasts. He told her about his mother's love for music, about his own dream of traveling to Italy, a dream his father had scoffed at. She told him about her brother Ronan, about her secret childhood desire to be a scholar, not a lady. The hatred was gone, replaced by a burgeoning respect that was quickly deepening into something more profound. The air between them crackled with a tension that was no longer born of animosity, but of a powerful, suppressed attraction. One evening, he came to her sitting room, a small, private parlor adjacent to her bedchamber. He held a small velvet box. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. He opened the box to reveal a delicate necklace, a single pearl suspended from a fine silver chain. "She would have wanted you to have it." Elara's eyes filled with tears. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was an acceptance, a symbol of the new reality they were building. "Kalen, it's beautiful. May I?" he asked. She nodded, turning around and lifting her hair. His fingers were warm and slightly trembling as he fastened the clasp around her neck. The cool pearl rested against her skin, a tangible reminder of his touch. When she turned back to face him, they were standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Elara," he breathed, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "This was not the life I envisioned. But you are not what I expected." "And what am I?" she whispered, her world reduced to the blue of his eyes. "You are a revelation," he said, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a claiming, a confession, a release of all the weeks of tension, anger, and burgeoning love. It was fire and solace, passion and promise. Her arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, her body molding to his as she kissed him back with all the pent-up feeling she had locked away. That night, she did not sleep in her cold, solitary bed. The walls between their chambers, both physical and emotional, crumbled to dust. In his arms, in the warmth of his bed, she found a home she had never known she was searching for. The enemy's sun had become her sanctuary. For a few blissful weeks, they lived in a bubble of their own making. They were Kaelan and Elara, a man and a woman in love, and the world outside with its feuds and its bitterness ceased to exist. But the outside world has a way of intruding. The bubble burst on a crisp autumn morning. A rider, covered in the dust of the road, bearing the Blackwood raven on his livery, galloped into the courtyard. He carried a message for Elara. With a sinking heart she broke the seal. It was from Ronan. "Sister, the truce is a lie. Grayson men have been encroaching on the western timberline again. There was a skirmish. A Blackwood woodsman was badly injured. Father is enraged. He believes you are either a fool, taken in by their charms, or a willing accomplice. He demands you return home at once to explain your husband's treachery. Do not fail in your duty to your family. Your brother, Ronan." The words swam before her eyes. Treachery, duty. The old, familiar poison seeped back into her heart. She looked up from the letter, her face pale, to find Kaelan standing in the doorway. His own expression grim. He held a similar missive. "It seems," he said, his voice cold and flat, the voice of the stranger she had married, "that our families are not yet done with us. My father has received word that Blackwood poachers have taken 3 stags from our royal hunting park. An act of provocation." The warmth of their bed, the memory of his kiss, the feel of the pearl at her throat, it all felt like a cruel dream. They were no longer just Kaelan and Elara. They were a Grayson and a Blackwood, standing on opposite sides of a chasm that had just reopened at their feet. The frost returned to Grayson Manor, colder and harder than before. The easy companionship between Elara and Kaelan vanished, replaced by a wary, painful silence. The accusations hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. Lord Cashin was incandescent with rage. "I knew it," he thundered at dinner, his fist hitting the table, making the silverware jump. "I knew the Blackwoods could not be trusted. This marriage was a mistake. They use our goodwill to stab us in the back." "We have only their word that this happened, father," Kaelan said, though his voice lacked conviction. He looked at Elara, a question in his eyes that he was too proud or too hurt to ask. "Did your family do this? Did you know?" Elara felt the weight of her own family's expectations. Ronan's letter was a summons to choose a side. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Their hearts are made of ice." Was Kaelan's love just a performance? A way to lull her into complacency while his family plotted? "And we are to take the word of a Blackwood over that of our own stewards." Cashin sneered, his gaze flicking to Elara. "The apple does not fall far from the tree." "That is enough," Kaelan said, his voice low and dangerous. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in the barren soil of their family's history, it grew like a poisonous weed. Elara retreated. She spent her days in her chambers or the library, the pearl necklace feeling like a weight of lead around her neck. Kaelan threw himself into his work, becoming distant and abrupt. The love they had found felt fragile now, a delicate glass sculpture that had been struck and was webbed with cracks. The breaking point came a week later. A formal letter arrived from Blackwood Manor, addressed to Elara. It was from her father. "Daughter, your silence is your answer. You have chosen your side. You are a Grayson now, in heart and name. Know this. If this feud reignites, the blood that is spilled will be on your hands. You had the power to prevent it, and you failed." Ronan sends no greeting. It was a disownment. Final, brutal severance. She was cast adrift, belonging nowhere. Not to the family of her birth, who saw her as a traitor, and not to the family of her marriage, who saw her as the enemy within their gates. She found Kaelan in his study, staring into the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his face a mask of weary stoicism. "I have received a letter from my father," she said, her voice trembling. She threw the parchment onto his desk. "I am dead to them." Kaelan read it, his expression growing darker with each word. When he finished, he looked at her, and the anger in his eyes was not directed at her, but at the situation. "This is what they do. They poison everything. Even this. Even us." "Is it poisoned, Kaelan?" she asked, tears finally spilling over. "Do you believe I knew about the poaching? Do you believe my family's lies over what we have built?" He was silent for a long moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound. "I don't know what to believe," he said finally, and the words were a knife to her heart. "My own father is convinced this is a Blackwood plot. And your brother," his message was clear. "You are to choose." "I chose you," she cried out, the raw pain finally breaking through. "I chose you when I let down my guard. I chose you when I let you into my bed, into my heart. But you are still choosing your family. You are still the loyal Grayson's son, unable to trust the Blackwood bride." She turned to leave, her world shattering around her, but his voice stopped her. "Elara, wait." She paused, her hand on the doorframe, but did not turn. "The poacher who was caught," Kaelan said, his voice heavy. "He didn't have Blackwood colors. He was just a man, desperate and hungry. My steward. He may have been overzealous. The skirmish on the timberline. The reports are conflicting. It might have been started by one of our own guards, a hot-headed boy with a grudge." She turned slowly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that our fathers, our brothers, they thrive on this conflict. They need it. Without the feud, what are they? Just bitter old men. They would rather burn the world down than see us build a bridge across it." He stood up, walking towards her. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a desperate, determined clarity. "I was a fool. I let their shadows darken our door. I let their war into our home." He stood before her, close enough to touch. "You asked me if I was choosing my family. Not. Choose you, Elara. Choose us. Whatever lies ahead, whatever battles we have to fight, I will fight them with you. Not as a Grayson against a Blackwood, but as your husband." He reached out and touched the pearl at her throat. "This is real. What I feel for you is real. It is the only thing that has ever been truly mine." The sobs she had been holding back broke free. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried, his own body shaking with the force of his emotion. It was their turning point. The moment they stopped being pawns and became players. The moment their love became an act of rebellion. The conspiracy of two began that night. They knew they could not confront their fathers directly. The old men were too entrenched in their hatred. Instead, they decided to fight the feud with truth and action. Kaelan, using his authority as the heir, quietly reassigned the hot-headed guard from the timberline and compensated the injured Blackwood woodsman's family from his own private funds, anonymously. He personally investigated the poaching incident and publicly reprimanded his own steward for his lack of evidence, restoring the reputation of the accused man. Elara, meanwhile, used her knowledge of her family's operations. She sent a carefully worded letter, not to her father or brother, but to the Blackwood steward, a pragmatic man named Edwin who had always been kind to her. She detailed the true condition of the North Slope soil and explained Kaelin's efforts to fix it, framing it not as a Grayson weakness, but as a point of stability that benefited all who lived on the land, including Blackwood tenants downstream. She included a small, personal note for her mother, speaking only of the weather and the gardens, a subtle thread of connection she hoped had not been fully severed. It was a dangerous game. They were walking a tightrope, appeasing their family's paranoia while secretly undermining the foundations of the feud. The final test came with the Harvest Festival. It was a tradition for both families to hold separate, competing festivals. This year, Kaelin and Elara decided to do the unthinkable. They invited the Blackwoods. The invitation, sent on fine parchment, was a masterpiece of diplomacy. It praised the recent peace, celebrated the joint prosperity of the lands, and extended a heartfelt welcome to Lord Blackwood and his family to join the Graysons in a unified celebration of the bounty they all shared. The day of the festival dawned clear and bright. The Grayson grounds were decorated with garlands of autumn leaves and sheaves of wheat. Tables groaned with food and ale. The tenants and villagers mingled, the atmosphere cautiously cheerful. Elara stood beside Kaelin at the entrance to the great hall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wore a gown of deep green, the color of the forest, and her mother's pearl necklace. Kaelin's hand found hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "we face it together." Then a trumpet sounded from the gate. A carriage bearing the Blackwood Raven rolled into the courtyard. The crowd fell silent. The carriage door opened. First came Alastair Blackwood, his face like thunder. Then Lady Blackwood, Elara's mother, her eyes wide and anxious. Finally Ronan emerged. He was taller, harder than Elara remembered, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His eyes scanned the crowd, bristling with hostility, until they landed on her. The two families stood facing each other across the courtyard, a gulf of 5 generations of hatred between them. The air was so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. Lord Cashan Grayson stepped forward, his smile brittle. "Alastair, you came." "I came to see what game you are playing, Cashan," Alastair Blackwood snarled. It was Kaelin who broke the stalemate. He released Elara's hand and walked forward, alone, into the space between the two families. He stopped before Alastair and gave a respectful bow. "Lord Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and carrying. "Thank you for honoring us with your presence. There is no game, only a hope. A hope that we can leave a better legacy for our children than the one left to us." He turned to include the whole crowd. "The poaching incident was a misunderstanding, caused by one of my own men who has been disciplined. The skirmish on the timberline was sparked by a youthful folly on both sides, and the men involved have been reconciled. The past is a shadow we have all lived under for too long. My wife." He turned and held his hand out to Elara. She walked to him, placing her hand in his, drawing strength from his touch. "My wife has shown me that the future does not have to be written with the ink of the past. This festival is not a Grayson victory or a Blackwood surrender. It is a new beginning. For all of us." He looked directly at Ronan. "Your sister is the bravest person I have ever known. She crossed a battlefield not with a sword, but with an open heart. The least we can do is to have the courage to take a single step across this courtyard." A profound silence followed his speech. Elara held her breath. She saw the conflict on her father's face, the war between a lifetime of hatred and the faint, flickering hope his daughter had kindled. Then something miraculous happened. Lady Blackwood, her eyes filled with tears, stepped forward. She walked past her husband, past her son, and crossed the courtyard. She stopped before Elara and cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "My child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You look well." It was the catalyst. The simple human act of a mother's love shattered the decades of enmity. The tension dissolved into a collective, released breath. Ronan, watching his mother, slowly removed his hand from his sword. He gave a curt, reluctant nod to Kaelin. It was not friendship, but it was a cessation of hostilities. Lord Cashan, seeing the tide had turned, gestured towards the feast. "Shall we?" The two families, hesitantly at first, then with growing purpose, began to mingle. The music started up again, tentatively, then with more confidence. Laughter, genuine and unforced, began to echo in the courtyard. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elara and Kaelan stood together, watching their family, dance and talk under the same roof. "It's not over," Kaelan said softly. "There will be setbacks. Old wounds will ache." "I know," Elara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But the war is over. The peace. This is just the beginning." She looked up at him, her husband, her partner, her love. The enemy's son had become her soulmate, and their union, born of conflict, had become the foundation for a lasting peace. The graft of thorns, against all odds, had begun to bloom.